So
Okay.
so to give context, so I teach with a method I call story learning, and the idea here is that you learn through stories. Now, stories in themselves is kind of on the same continuum as any other immersion-based method, right? So whereas Matt might talk about, for example, learning through TV. Someone else might talk about learning through, I don't know, podcasts. For me, it's stories. And when I'm talking about stories, I'm talking specifically about reading and listening to those stories. You're reading a book and you're listening to the audio. So as a starting point, all the things I just mentioned are basically the same general approach to language learning, which is an input-based approach, what we call it. So the idea is, rather than studying grammar rules and memorizing lists of words like you did at school, instead you get input in the language. So you're reading and listening, and that is the better way round to do it, because you end up getting a complete view of the language, right, rather than the kind of bite-sized McNugget approach to studying like we do traditionally. So that's the first thing to say. Now, why stories in particular? So my belief is that if you take the approach of, okay, we want to learn through immersion. Yes, great, tick. But that our approach to language learning is going to be, right, let's just go and listen to 5,000 hours of Japanese. Now, from my perspective as a teacher, and I have a long background of teaching languages as well, which is another topic. But from my perspective, this is where it falls down when the rubber hits the road, right? Because most people are simply not going to sit and listen to 5,000 hours of the language. Even if I told you, look, this is the best way, you won't do it. You'll get bored. You'll get distracted. You'll get frustrated. So my methods are focused very much on how does this work in the real world. I want you to get all the main benefits of immersion, but I want you to actually be able to do it and follow through and stay motivated, because I think that ultimately I'm going to be able to help the most people that way than if I turn up and say, hey, I've got the clinically, scientifically proved best method, but then no one can actually follow through.
Can I stop you real quick?
Sure.
So you said no one has time to listen to 5,000 hours of Japanese. Yeah. But even if you listen to 5,000 hours of Japanese and there's no English subtitles and you don't know what the hell's going on, you've never learned one word in Japanese, I feel like you're just hearing noise. I feel like that's not, maybe 30,000 hours of Japanese you'll start putting stuff together, but I don't think 5,000 hours is enough if you don't understand what's going on. You're just reading kanjis.
So my view is that if you spend long enough doing anything, you will learn it. And I think there's a slight kind of a sequencing issue here, right? Because I don't think anyone would suggest that if you come to Japanese on day one, then the first thing you should do is just watch movies for 12 hours a day. You know, you can go through a textbook for your first month or whatever, just to get the basics. All right. So I mean, I think that, but that's a drop in the ocean, but it's just a way to get started. The principle here is that let's assume you learn the basics. Then the question you're asking is, can you actually learn by just listening to 10,000 hours of Japanese? And my answer is yes, you can, if you actually do listen to 10,000 hours, which in reality no one ever will. Right. And B, you actively listen. And this is the key, right? You can't just have it on in the background whilst you're doing the dishes. You actually have to focus, because part of learning through immersion involves actually focusing heavily on the thing that you're listening to. Not all the time, not like
even if you barely understand anything, even if you understand one word out of 300.
At first, yeah. But the thing is, if you're, say, watching movies or reading anime, then what you will find over time is that you start to put together the patterns, and you start to say, okay, there's that word again. And then given enough repetitions, you start to see that, because most languages actually have a very small number of core vocabulary. So, you know, the stat that's often used is there are, 100 words in English account for 50% of all the words you'll ever hear in the language. Words like and the and go and have, right? So just by brute repetition, you will start to do it. All right. So I think the theory is sound, just in exactly the same way as we could say, yeah, interstellar travel. We know how it would work in theory, but like we're not, but it's not
Yeah.
going to happen. And so to kind of work backwards from there, my approach is to say, okay, I want you to get the benefits of full immersion from the beginning. So what I do is I create very simple stories in the language, and I have you read and listen to those stories from day one.
Oh, listen
And
too. It's audiobook?
yeah,
Oh, wow.
so it's both. It's both. It's the text and the audio. Why? Because reading is the more convenient way to study, but listening because I want you to get used to hearing the sounds of the language, because you want to be able to understand people as well, right? So
Mhm.
it comes together. So on day one, I will have you reading and listening to a very simple story in the language. And then your next question is, but how do you understand anything on day one? The answer is, I get you to spend time with the language, read and listen to that, say the first chapter of a story, and then I come in with a lesson and I help you kind of uncover what you've just listened to. So
Mm.
I kind of come in with some tuition at the beginning, because my belief is, if I can just teach you a few key things along with everything that you're consuming, then your intellectual consciousness will be able to move a lot faster at the beginning. It will get you moving. And then so I combine very simple stories, which is kind of my version of immersion, along with a little bit of tuition, which just starts to create
Mm.
this snowball effect.
Yeah.
And then you keep that up, and then you just start to kind of scale up from there. And my ultimate aim is to get you to the point where you can read and listen to anything without any explanations at all.
Yeah, I didn't know that you had an audiobook component of it. I thought it was just reading, which, then you can get into the pronunciation and hearing the
Yeah,
languages.
exactly.
Because I can look at, I have about, I don't know, almost 1,000 flashcards of Spanish and almost 1,000 flashcards of German. And I can go through that and I can read it. And I might even know that this word means sun or this word means desk, but it might sound completely different. And that's going to screw me up moving forward.
Yeah. So my critique of that approach that you've just described there is that it fits neatly into what you described earlier as the kind of the 80-20ification of language learning, right? And yes, you can learn the most important stuff at the beginning and then shortcut to a certain extent. But the amount that you're shortcutting is the first 0.5% of the journey. So what's left ahead of you is like the rest of the language, right? And so what happens is, I think that the approach you're describing could be great potentially for the first 100, 200 words, just to get you going.
Mhm.
But once you get beyond that, what you find is that words in a language can't be neatly distilled onto a flashcard, right? So the word bear in English, think of all the different meanings of the word bear. It can be the animal, it can mean naked, it can mean carrying or giving, it can mean carrying a child, right? So there are many words like that word in other languages which have multiple meanings and multiple nuances as well. What's the difference between great, fantastic, wonderful, excellent, awesome? Really,
Right.
like, how would you
I
ever
feel like
describe
English speakers, they forget that. When they
Yeah.
learn a new language, they're like, "Wow, Spanish, one word has 6 different meanings." In Japanese, I guess Japanese. I'm not that educated in Japanese language learning, but with Mandarin, it's like, "Oh, this one word has 9 different sounds and it means completely different things." Well, did you forget that English is the same way, but you're just used to it? And then when you
Yeah.
start to think about it, like, wow, two has 3 different words and it's two. And they're like, oh, wow. Depending on how I use two in a sentence dictates what that two specifically means.
There you go. And so
Why do people forget that?
because we're not educated in languages, it's something we never know consciously, right? So if you follow that through to its logical conclusion, then you realize that it doesn't do you much good to memorize snippets of information. You're far better off spending your time with what's called the whole language. So rather than one word on a flashcard, an entire book. Because even though you're not going to be able to memorize everything in that book, every hour every minute that you spend with that book, you're getting exposure to the whole language, the grammar, the vocabulary, the culture, the ways of speaking. And so it's the difference between what you call an atomistic approach and a holistic approach. Right? So the atomistic approach is what you described there with the flashcards, focusing on the part, versus the holistic approach, focusing on the whole, saying if we just spend enough time in the company of the language, then eventually, however fast or slow we learn, we will emerge on the other side with a complete, genuine, authentic view of everything that the language is. Right. And so, yeah, that's the theory.